Okay, it is 5 p.m. in Vienna and probably a different time from in other location, including in Moscow, in Washington, and other places, wherever you're joining us today. Dear colleagues and friends, my name is Elena Sokova. I'm the Executive Director of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, and it's a great pleasure for me today to invite you to join us for a very timely discussion. Tomorrow, as many of you know, Russian President Vladimir Putin and US President Joe Biden will be meeting in Geneva to discuss the state of and prospects for US-Russian relations. Arms control and nuclear non-proliferation are expected to be on the agenda of the summit. This is the area where interests of Moscow and Washington not only overlap, but as many analysts in Russia, the United States, and around the globe hope that they could also pave way to a more constructive and regular engagement between the two countries and to getting out of the pattern of reaching a new low in their relations almost with every passing month. I'm particularly delighted that we're able to partner with Peer Center for this discussion. And I'm even more pleased that the new book that the Peer Center will present today, titled Russia-US Nuclear Non-Proliferation Dialogue, Lessons Learned and Road Ahead, features many young scholars and practitioners from Russia. I'm hopeful that policymakers in both countries will take a note of these lessons from the past cooperation in nuclear non-proliferation and arms control. And I'm also noticed that the book is devoted to Ambassador Ronald Timmerweif. He would have been very proud to see such strong interest of the next generation to nuclear arms control and non-proliferation. If Dr. William Potter is among our listeners today, he must be very proud as well. This is something that Ambassador Timmerweif and Dr. Potter embraced in the early 90s. And as Dr. Potter writes in his preface to the book, we set out jointly with Ambassador Timmerweif to recruit and nurture a new cadre of non-proliferation experts and rebuild the institutional memory about non-proliferation cooperation in the two countries. Peer Center nowadays plays a critical role in building that cadre of next generation experts. And I'm both delighted that we are able to partner with you today for this presentation and work in this area with you in other projects as well. And I'm also looking forward to listening from some of these representatives from the next generation during our webinar today. But without keeping us any longer, I want to make sure our speakers have enough time to present their findings, and we also have a productive Q&A session. Let me quickly introduce our speakers. Dr. Vladimir Orlov, he's the director of Peer Center and a long partner in crimes, working on many issues related to US-Russia cooperation, including on the education of next generation of experts. And Heather Conley, Senior Vice President for Europe, Eurasia, and the Arctic, and Director of the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Adlan Margoev, who is Analyst and Chief Strategy Officer at the Institute for International Studies at MGIMO University, and Sergey Semenov, who coordinates the Russia Nuclear Non-Proliferation Program at Peer Center. So without further ado, just a quick note to our listeners. Please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A function during the panel presentation or afterwards. those of you who are listening to us or viewing the webinar on YouTube, you can send it to events@vcdnp.org. With that, Dr. Orlov, my pleasure to give you the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to Elena, Sokova, and to the VCDNP for being so generous in providing this platform for our discussion today. Needless to say, Peer Center has always been happy to partner and cooperate both with our colleagues in Vienna and our colleagues in Monterey, definitely to be continued. Frankly speaking, this week for me has two major events. And one of these events is the summit, the ongoing summit starting tomorrow in Geneva between Presidents Putin and Biden. And the second event of this week for me is avant-premiere of our book on Russia-US dialogue on non-proliferation, lessons learned and a road ahead. Needless to say, there is certain overlap between these two events, and I probably with all my modesty, will start with the book, and then I will go to the summit, which starts tomorrow. The book is a result of work of 20 authors and contributors throughout recent 5 years, and also has been fruit of our very close collaboration with our friends and partners in Monterey and beyond. We looked at the history, at the 5 decades of history of US-Russian dialogue, collaboration, confrontation, but we tried to look at some positive aspects which could be helpful for us as the baggage for the future, either short-term or longer term. And we definitely enjoyed the very rich group of individuals, intellectually extremely rich discussions. I'm grateful to Professor William Potter for his preface. And actually, Bill, thank you for being with us today for the initial part of our discussion. We have here a mix of people. Some of them are very, very experienced here, including the head of the Russian delegation to the START one, Ambassador Nazarkin. But also you can see here the authors, they're mostly young and very, very young people. And that was one of the major tasks, both of the study and on the book, to bring impressions of those who are the next generation and those who will be decision makers not so far from now. Actually, let me present a few conclusions, not necessarily from the book. You can click and see the conclusions there on the website. But let me present some of the conclusions of my own as an editor of this book, together with Sergey Semenov, who is my colleague at the Peer Center and graduate of our excellent dual degree program in Non-Proliferation Studies, Peer Center, MGIMO in Monterey. The first lesson is I do believe that with all increasing importance of the P5 dialogue and process, our two nations, Russia and the United States, still have special responsibility for the smooth running of the NPT, its review cycle, and for the successful future conferences. My second conclusion is that blame game in and around the NPT review process is wasting of time. I suggest that both nations should re-establish the tradition of cooperative game, if you like, and put the blame game aside. Tradition of cooperation game between the two nuclear superpowers has been established on our side by Andrei Gromyko, who had insisted that despite of all contradictions we had, and we always had them with the United States, despite of all the heavy baggage of disagreements, despite the Vietnams and Afghanistans, nuclear weapons and prevention of their proliferation in the world is so vital for Soviet national security as well as for global security, that this issue should be treated as a separate basket, free from the strains which could affect other baskets. Americans normally accepted such a separation. And of course, now we speak not on Soviet, but post-Soviet and Russian history here. Not that it always been easy, particularly during the darkest day of the Cold War, but mostly it worked. And as a result, we now have a very short list of nations outside the NPT and with nuclear weapons. With the bilateral blame game, believe me, such list could be much longer. And it would not have been good news for our own security, needless to say, for the global security needed. My third conclusion is that we should resume and rebuild bilateral Russian-American holistic dialogue on three pillars of the NPT. And of course, this includes traditional horizontal proliferation prevention, further arms reductions and limitations. Yes, I mean it. I'm talking about further reductions and working hard on that. And of course, bilateral Russian-American peaceful cooperation in nuclear energy, which now has been severely damaged with sanctions and more. And there are other issues on the agenda bilaterally, which you see on the screen. One of the issues actually to avoid a further blame game against those who joined the TPNW. Instead of having that an excuse that others have their own treaty, let us see more positively how we build bridges and how all of us work on a safer world. And my final conclusion here is that, of course, Russian-American dialogue should not be a panacea. It's important. Tomorrow it would be hopefully even more important than today. But working multilateral, working through the P5, it's increasingly important as well with China, with France, with United Kingdom. And we have quite an impressive agenda for having a basket for Russian-American dialogue on non-proliferation and also for this P5 dialogue. And definitely we speak a lot in our book about bilateral issues. Those 16 chapters speak for themselves. My final comment would be on the summit tomorrow. Actually, what we can discuss it, of course, so I probably would leave some details to the Q&A, and I'm sure other speakers would like to touch upon that. But my only point here would be that we really strongly needed, as international community, we do need a new detente. Actually, good word when you are in Geneva, are much desired. And there is a question, of course, there are expectations. Should they be realistic to expect that tomorrow a new detente will be established in Geneva? Definitely not, unfortunately not. But the foundations, some building blocks, some new building blocks for that detente, for that new detente, I do believe we have a certain chance that tomorrow the two leaders would help bringing that fresh air and removing that polluted air from our relations. At least Peer Center as a non-governmental organization, both Russian and international one, in cooperation with our partners globally, would like to contribute to that process. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Volodya. Much appreciated. I fully subscribe to your message about what we hope to achieve from the summit. And I'm also more than sure that we'll touch upon this issue in our discussion in the Q&A. But now I'm very pleased to give a virtual screen and microphone to Heather. Heather, please.
Elena, thank you so much for this kind invitation, and my warmest congratulations to the Peer Center for the release of their new book. I think it is essential to bring new voices and a new generation into this conversation, and I know we have certainly benefited from that approach in a Track 2 dialogue that CSIS held with the Peer Center for 2 years, looking at the future of US-Russian strategic stability. So I thought I would in some ways pick up where Volodya left off and talk a bit more about very contemporaneous issues related to tomorrow's US-Russia summit in Geneva, of which all eyes are on that. Of course, there are growing questions, I would say, in the press and among analysts here in the United States about exactly what the outcome of this summit will be. And at least the initial reports that we're getting from press interviews with senior White House and administration officials is that the one deliverable that is hoped for is something more focused on the strategic stability talks. So I think the thinking of building blocks isn't exactly the right approach as we think about rebuilding a US-Russian strategic culture around arms control. The good news is we have a strategic culture. It is deep and ingrained, and we need to pass that strategic culture to the next generation. The problem is that strategic culture is out of practice. It's gotten very flabby because over the last decade, since the New START Treaty in 2010, we really haven't engaged in deep, comprehensive arms control. The good news is one of the very first acts of the Biden administration was extending the New START Treaty for 5 years, but 5 years is 5 minutes. And the challenge is we have so much distrust between the United States and Russia. We now have growing classes of new technologies, cyber space, technologies for both non-strategic as well as strategic, that in some ways we really do need to comprehensively modernize our strategic stability and arms control conversation. So with hope that one of the outcomes after the Geneva summit will be this framing of the strategic stability talks, I just would like to offer a few brief reflections over the Track 2 dialogue that we held with Peer Center to think about those building blocks. And I offer 3 of those building blocks that I think are actually should be prioritized. The challenge of this, of course, is sequencing. It's the interaction between the strategic, the non-strategic, and the conventional. And as I mentioned, it's the challenge of transparency and verification. While we have a great deal of practice in negotiating when there's an absence of trust on both sides, This time feels a little different. We don't have the structures and the rigidity that we had during the Cold War in this conversation. That is gone. That hasn't been replaced. And we need to think again, rebuilding what we call the arms control scaffolding for the 21st century. So let me just offer 3 reflections. And again, I look forward to the questions and comments during the discussion period. For me, there are 3 priorities that I would like to see US-Russian strategic talks begin. The first and foremost is I don't think we're going to get a legally binding treaty anytime soon. In part, that is a function of US politics and the difficulty of getting any treaty ratified, let alone arms control, let alone with Russia. It's just a very, very difficult process. So I think what we need to do, those building blocks, is building principles, code of conduct, agreements, and being able to rebuild trust between the 2 parties. So the first I would work on is an agreement in principle with Russia to avoid any cyber attacks against nuclear command and control authority. We are seeing the growth of cyber attacks, ransomware attacks. That is going to be one of the key topics of discussion, at least from the US side in tomorrow's summit. How can we put guardrails on this to make sure that that's an essential part of our arms control and our strategic stability talks going forward? The second priority I would highlight is beginning a conversation on space, anti-satellite weapons, space-based assets. This, of course, is a huge topic, but it's increasingly now becoming an issue for, again, command and control, ISR. So thinking about space holistically. The third priority I would have is on high-speed, high-precision weapons, global strike, hypersonics. This is a class where we do need to start getting our arms around. If we can build those building blocks, getting agreement, getting some framing around those, these are not legal and binding treaties. They would be in principle. We would try to provide trust and verification around those. Could this be the beginning of the future for a next generation to take us and build that arms control scaffolding? That would be the hope. That would be my 3 places of prioritization. There are so many others. The important thing is that we get started as quickly as possible. Thanks, Elena.
Thank you, Heather. All great ideas and suggestions. I like you using the term scaffolding rather than crutches or something like that. It's much better. But anyway, well, let's give the floor to our next speaker, Adlan. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Good morning, evening to all of you. It's glad to be with you. Thank Peer Center for inviting to speak and VCDNP for hosting the event. With the revival of the flights between Austria and Russia, I hope to see some of you in future in person. I was to share some of the lessons that I identified on US-Russia dialogue on Iran's nuclear program since 1992. That was my chapter in the forthcoming book. But since much of that was written during the Trump administration, and at those times, the lessons that I identified did not sound banal at all. They were all relevant because the disregard for those lessons heavily backfired in our field and for Iran and non-proliferation regime specifically. But since we have a new administration in the US, already, which is not new, half a year has been through. And I think repeating those lessons that the US has relearned with the change in administration would make sense at this point. But based on them, I would rather focus on a few recommendations that I could have for Russia-US dialogue on Iran from now on. After the extension of New START, I think the revival of the JCPOA has to be the second in a row achievement in the field of non-proliferation and arms control, with great participation of our 2 nations and partners in the field. But it appears that the revival of the JCPOA will not be enough, at least for the US, and Washington is set to go beyond the JCPOA and continue its diplomatic effort with the Iranians. And a few reflections based on the experience of Russia-US bilateral dialogue on Iran, and I'm going to offer them now. On engaging Iran, I think the strengthen and lengthen approach vis-a-vis the JCPOA won't fly well, if at all, in Tehran. Before the Iranians feel the benefits from adhering to the JCPOA, finally, so many years after its conclusion, I think no discussions are possible and they are not going to yield a positive result. The motivation that the Trump administration, on the Iranian side, that the Trump administration worked on was the negative one through squeezing the Iranians and suffocating them with sanctions. The Trump administration expected to reach an agreement that would sound like a capitulation for the Iranians, but they would apparently would have to at some point, as some believed in Washington, to reach such agreement to secure the future of the political regime and government in Tehran. This did not work out as expected with the change in administration. The policy of Washington has to change, and we have to see the delineation between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. And that has to be visible in Tehran, first of all, to continue the diplomatic effort between the two countries. And that also means offering incentives, not just expecting that there would be some concessions on the Iranian side, new concessions, either on nuclear issues or regional or ballistic missile program and policies. So the motivations for which the US would have to work with Iran from now on has to be switched to the positive one. And I think the new diplomatic initiatives should not be branded as the JCPOA plus or JCPOA 2.0, etc. For branding purposes, it should be framed as something different. And for the Iranians to not feel singled out and squeezed to yield some new concessions, I think new discussions have to be regional, involving all the regional or most of the regional actors who have relevant capabilities in terms of their regional policies and ballistic missile programs. So with that, we might expect some support on the Iranian side of regional initiatives in those fields. On the Russia-US dialogue, I'm glad to see that it has resumed on Iran, with something that we didn't have over the past 4 years. And Russian expertise on regional issues and its relationships with the regional countries will be necessary and unavoidable in the process of trying to reach some new agreements in the region. And I think it provides a unique opportunity to seek an inclusive regional security system. If that is not what the US administration wants to see in the Middle East, I have regrettably few positive expectations from whatever endeavor will be taken in the region. Russia, as I believe, is dedicated to both bilateral dialogue with the US on all the security-related issues and regional issues in the Middle East, and the dialogue with all the regional countries involved. Both of the tracks have to be working and operational, and one cannot substitute the other. And I hope that such dialogue between our governments will resume, if not tomorrow after the Geneva summit, but very, very soon. And such dialogue between two governments will require similar, if not even more even closer cooperation between think tanks and academia and expert communities of the two countries and other countries involved and interested in this process. And I think I'll stop here and look forward to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Adlan. Thank you. And indeed, like many eyes are also nowadays on Vienna and the continuing negotiations there of the JCPOA. Thank you for offering your remarks, including your thoughts about the future, building on the JCPOA and how it could unfold. And I'm now going to give the floor to Sergey Semenov, who will conclude the prepared remarks for our panel. Sergey, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me share my screen and I'll begin my talk. All right. Once again, thank you. It's a great pleasure to speak before such a representative audience, and it is a particular pleasure to speak in the diplomatic capital of non-proliferation, at least for the time being, in Vienna, at least virtually, where the talks on the restoration of JCPOA are ongoing. Many of the points I'd like to make today build on two parallel efforts: our dialogue with CSIS on strategic stability matters and our 5 years long effort to write this monograph on US-Russian non-proliferation cooperation. Dr. Orlov was very optimistic, very positive about the dialogue. I'd like to make some cautious remarks because our dialogue was wave-like, and we should also explore the reasons for the failures, for the downs in our non-proliferation cooperation. My first point is that there is adaptation to think, to strive for the restoration of past patterns of cooperation. Say, in the 1960s, we managed to jointly construct the NPT architecture. That was a huge effort, and we are grateful to Ambassador Timir for that. But we should be mindful that every pattern of cooperation is a child of its time, a child of its epoch. And it would be impossible to restore previous modicums of cooperation without properly adapting them to the realities of our time. The current model of US-Russian non-proliferation dialogue is not a comprehensive partnership. It's not a privileged partnership. It's rather a crisis management model. And our contacts are most vibrant and most effective when the two countries, when Washington and Moscow, are compelled to cooperate on a matter of urgency, Iran being the most vivid example. Day-to-day cooperation, say on the NPT maintenance or on IA safeguards, is also present, but it is less vibrant and less energetic. My second point would be about the stumbling blocks for restoring cooperation. The first of them is that our countries do not see each other as reliable partners. Currently, both in Moscow and in Washington, D.C., there is a perception that the counterpart is rather playing politics instead of solving real non-proliferation problems. Another factor, another stumbling block, let alone the psychological issues, is that the world has changed. We are no longer in the 1960s. We are no longer in a state of affairs where we can solve the non-proliferation issues just by talking to each other, where we can jointly construct two of the most important articles of the NPT. My third point is that we should move from solely bilateral formats to more of a multilateral milieu. As the experience of JCPOA has shown, and has shown very eloquently, multilateral solutions tend to work better. At least they give time to wait for the next US administration to take place. But here I have to make a cautious note by saying that multilateral solutions are not possible everywhere. There is adaptation to move everything to multilateral milieu, non-proliferation, arms control, but still, it's not possible. For instance, if we talk about the P5 format, it is a promising venue. And here we have a very important element, the discussion of doctrinal issues within the P5 members. However, in the near future, it would be not realistic to expect that stuff like arms control infrastructure would appear on the basis of P5. Rather, we should move on with the doctrinal discussions to identify what specific elements of our nuclear doctrines are of most concern and what confidence-building measures may be instituted to allay those concerns. As you may know, Russia has proposed the idea of strategic evasion to deal with new threats or to strategic stability and to construct the new arms control infrastructure. However, some of the elements of the strategic evasion can only be settled, can only be drafted through multilateral channels. For instance, here we have to talk about outer space weaponization, where more countries than just the United States and Russia have the potential to destabilize the situation, which have the anti-satellite capabilities, which have relevant cyber potentials. The role for the US-Russian dialogue is to incentivize multilateral cooperation, because regardless of the potentials and capabilities possessed by other states, most acute divergences and contradictions take place between Russia and the United States. And here I move on to the arms control infrastructure of the future. Again, we should note that Russia and the United States are willing to revisit previous patterns of arms control. They are no longer satisfied with it being always strategic offensive arms. We want to say Russia wants to bring all things strategic under the scope of future agreements. With the United States, the concern is a little bit different. The United States wants to bring all things nuclear, both strategic and non-strategic warheads, under the scope of future agreements, plus institute more intrusive verification measures. And the last point I'd like to make is a caution against striving for the ideal, for the perfection, especially when it comes to verification and confidence-building measures. Given the current climate of distrust, current vitriolic exchanges between our countries, such intrusiveness would raise only more questions. And here we should go back to the experience of STAT1 implementation, which really enjoyed broad and intrusive verification measures. As a result, in the Joint Compliance and Implementation Commission, which was the analog of the Bilateral Consultative Commission under the STAT1, we had constant exchanges, constant debates on whether Russia was in compliance or was not, whether the United States was not in compliance or was. And in the current climate of distrust, I'm not sure that such debates, as we see from the workings of Bilateral Consultative Commission, would be solved constructively. Here, I would like to stop, and I'm looking forward to your comments and your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sergey, and thank you for kind of providing a reality check for many of us. Of course, there are hopes and many parties are hopeful, but it's always good to keep in mind that there are some limitations, and a number of questions that already came in will probably be something that we would need to tackle. But before I go to questions related on specific issues on substance, there was a number of questions from our audience about where you can actually access the book, whether it will be published online or where you could buy it. Maybe we can start with that. Either Sergey or Vladimir, who can answer that question. Vladimir?
Yeah, that's an easy one, and normally the publishers rule. Our publishers, both in Russia, Vladimir, and in the United States, Belgrave, They do not permit us for putting currently the whole book online. So I saw the legitimate questions that there are only conclusions there. Yes, conclusions is better than nothing, and we probably for educational purposes would publicly share some other chapters. But when the book is actually from the publisher, we will be happy to send a note for all those of you who gathered here. And I didn't coordinate it with Elena, but probably with Elena's permission, we would disseminate the information where you can get the book, buy the book, purchase the book, or where you can get it for educational purposes, free or some parts of it. So unfortunately, we're limited here with this, but would be happy to share, of course, as much as we can, and waiting for coming to Vienna physically with the bags and with the heavy baggage, literally, with the books in it, with the hard copies at some point. Thank you.
Thank you, Volodya. And now to a little bit harder questions. First of them is coming from Louis Reichman. Is a question to you and to Heather. Many of the obstacles to US-Russian arms control advances come from domestic politics in both countries. How do you see the impact of domestic politics on these issues and on the summit, and how it could be mitigated? So anyone would like to jump in? Heather, maybe you first. I know you would have to leave early a little bit, so if you don't mind.
Yes, Elena, you can front load the questions so I can get them before I have to sign off. Well, it's an excellent question, and in fact, I think Volodya can also say that this actually consumed a lot of our track 2 conversation, and obviously it was, I think, more on the domestic politics in the United States and how that plays out. But we also learned, even within Russia, where we thought there was one procedure to extend the New START Treaty by 5 years, there was actually a different procedure that went into place to actually do it. So there's a little uncertainty on process even within the Russian Federation. But you're absolutely right. And this really focuses very pragmatically on the lack of trust, and exactly why, to Sergey's point, that the US is putting in, whether it's Republican or I think it will be a Democratic administration, putting in very intrusive verification processes because the trust is just absolutely absent. So those verification tools are absolutely essential to get bipartisanship in supporting any future arms control treaty that must be ratified by the Senate. I will say, and I think this is in part and parcel what we're seeing in the politics around tomorrow's summit in Geneva, there is bipartisanship regarding Russia. It's a quite hawkish, quite very, very focused on Russia's policy and its behaviors. And that spills over into the arms control regime and agenda. So what we'll likely see tomorrow is some positive statements about a process to start dealing with strategic stability, and this will be welcomed. The challenge is the list of issues that the United States is in contestation with Russia. There are internal issues regarding Russia, neighborhood policies, Syria policy. That starts to bleed into the arms control conversation, and it becomes very difficult to keep those separate. This is why we've sort of, we're focusing on a more pragmatic approach, a step-by-step, starting to build consensus around principles and code of conduct, where we can watch the conduct, we can make sure that there's trust, and we can verify that both sides are implementing their agreement in principle, and then we build on greater confidence and to do more difficult things. Absent that, I think it is very difficult to see where there is a bipartisan environment to support a reconstituted or improved, modernized New START treaty. There's just too much distrust. So you're absolutely right in asking the issue. I don't have any magic solutions to it. We're just hoping this step-by-step approach where our interests intersect and we can get agreement on both sides that are willing to implement that agreement and not violate it or withdraw from it. That will be helpful in trying to build that credibility, but that extends beyond 5 years. I mean, in 5 years, we could have a new US administration or President Biden may be reelected. We don't know. We don't know the composition of the Senate. So all of those factors are really challenging to get an agreement in the next 5 years when New START ends.
Thank you, Heather. Well, Volodya, would you like to add a few words?
Yeah, I think this is an excellent question because we are, I think, surprisingly for some, we in Moscow do find a very vibrant domestic landscape for foreign policy, security, or non-proliferation discussions. Are not always that much seen on the scene, sometimes behind the scene. For the Vienna audience, I may just give one example. Well, we have been having quite a vibrant discussion over the CTBT. And of course, there were groups of people in Russia and not just some individuals who were questioning why Russia should still be in the CTBT and not test while Americans do not show any sign on ratifying. And I would say this is something we face in a number of fronts. I just gave you one easiest example probably to address because it's gone, and of course Russia is in the CTBT and will be, and it should not be misinterpreted. And I think this is really good that we have quite a number of think tanks, quite a number of groups in Russia where we can sit and discuss. There are generational differences. There are, of course, a lot of interagency clashes, so don't take it wrong. We do have quite intensive discussion also prior to tomorrow's Geneva summit. Here, of course, one thing which may make it different from some other places, we have President of the Russian Federation who very strongly keeps in his hands the foreign policy. Foreign policy is made by the president, full stop. And we have President of the Russian Federation who has demonstrated his very strong commitment to nuclear non-proliferation. This helps a lot. That's it. It's much more complex story, of course, when it comes to strategic stability and bilateral US-Russian relations. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. The questions keep coming. One question that I would really like for you maybe to tackle is, before we move forward, actually 2 questions, and you can choose which one of you would like to answer, Heather, because I know you'll have to leave a little bit earlier. One question relates to how can the US and Russia incentivize or facilitate China or other P5 states to rebuild a post-INF framework, including covering other regions, including Indo-Pacific and European regions, and then joining in a track 1.5 dialogue. That means engaging China and other P5 on these issues and on strategic stability. So that would be one question. Then the other that is asked by Hiroaki Makanishi. The other question that I would like for one of you to pick up, or our other speakers today, Sergey or Adlan, is what are the chances for seeing for progress in starting the negotiations of the follow-on to START treaty. It's like, are we going to expect that sometime soon, or this is something in distant future? What are your expectations on that? So these two, engaging China and others on post-INF, and the prospects for the new START treaty. Heather, I'll give you the floor first. Pick the one question that you would like to answer.
Thank you, Elena. These are great questions. Well, we do know we cannot force China to the arms control table, or we cannot force Russia to try to force China to the table. That was tried, obviously, very unsuccessfully during the Trump administration. And again, as part of our Track 2 dialogue, I think there was great agreement on both sides with the US and Russia that didn't work. So how do we do this? We do have to engage China in a broader arms control conversation. I think, though, in the near term, Beijing will continue to refuse to do that. So I think what we have to do is create the environment, again, where there is the longest standing strategic culture to begin that dialogue with the United States and Russia, and then certainly try to build as many incentives as we can to encourage China to engage in that. It is difficult, even just on warhead mechanism, that there's such great disparity between the United States and Russia, and then China. Chinese government officials have also underscored this inequality, if you will. But I think if the United States and Russia can begin that conversation, both the United States and Russia have to find opportunities to encourage Beijing to be part of that conversation. Without Beijing being part of that conversation, we will always be thwarted in getting greater progress between the United States and Russia. That's just the reality, I think, of the US strategic view. And as I said, I think there are ways that we can move forward with that. Just to sort of reflection on the post-INF world, I think this is, again, the difficulty is we have so many priorities that we really need to start addressing. This one is clearly significant. If you've read the NATO communique, this was put forward very strongly in that language. We don't have that mechanism, and intermediate missiles are of concern, addressing the questions of moratoriums and things like that. So I hope, again, whether we track to that or track 1.5 it, where is experts can start being creative and government officials can listen to that and see if there's interest in some of that creativity, I'd be delighted. But that is going to continue to be a profound challenge, particularly for European and transatlantic issues. And it would be better to have an avenue of approach that we can start addressing that.
Thank you. Who would like to add to that or tackle the next kind of START type treaty? Volodya, I see you unmuted yourself, so that is a sign for me that you would like to take the floor.
Thank you, Elena. I probably would just continue a little bit on China issue. Actually, I think in Russia we find quite a number of people who are very positive in engaging China. Basically, why not? And the issue of having strategic stability discussions involving China, I think they're logical ones. I explored just earlier today how in Geneva Ambassador Wood from the United States called on China to join the strategic stability debates. Of course, discussions. Of course, China should come to that idea by itself voluntarily. We have in Russia kind of intimate discussions with China on quite a number of issues, including very sensitive issues of nuclear weapons, nuclear planning, nuclear proliferation, and these are good discussions that helps us. But I would definitely not mind to see those discussions being put into pipeline, being put into a broader system. But then I do have a question. Why only China? And we have the P5, which I mentioned. And I think there are questions and issues concerning all the P5 nations and not pick and choosing one which has aircraft carriers or whatever is of interest for the US media. And I think it's of natural interest for many. Anyway, when it comes to the P5 discussion, we should probably be realistic, but also creative. One of my ideas has been for quite some time, at least, to make sure that the P5 does not increase the number of nuclear weapons. And needless to say, many of us had one country in mind, which is Russian direct neighbor here. Nobody wanted to see that country starting with C to increase twice or whatever. But instead, I saw a completely different country from the P5 to start increasing its nuclear weapons, which sometimes probably is off our radar screen, which is United Kingdom. So approaching the issue holistically would help and would be healthy. Thank you.
Thank you, Volodya. And Sergey would like to add something. Please go ahead.
Just 2 points on China, if I may. The first one, dealing with strategic stability. China has not been offered something to discuss. We are still struggling with this traditional concept of arms control, meaning strategic offensive arms control, etc., but China is different, and that is something we have to keep in mind. And the point which is often missed was clearly expressed by Russia and China in its 2016 statement on global strategic stability. And in Russian Chinese understanding, strategic stability is broader. It is, as Vladimir Orlov mentioned, about military buildups in the proximity of national borders. So the discussion is needed, but the discussion should be broader. And this is where I move to my second point about the concept of arms control. The classic of arms control studies, Thomas Sherwin, noted that arms control is about all forms of military cooperation between potential adversaries. So the key point, potential adversaries. And the point of strategic stability discussions should be for the People's Republic of China and the United States to determine the issues where they have mutual concerns, not just about trying to bring China into the existing formats. Sorry for making this.
Thank you, Sergey, and thank you, Heather, and goodbye. She had to leave. As time is approaching for the end of our webinar, I have there are excellent questions and actually very nice comments to our panelists today, both for the professionalism and deep knowledge of our speakers, but also very good cooperative spirit. But we have very little time left, and I have 2 questions to you. One is coming from Mustafa Sadibogu Tal from Senegal, where he asks, like, what, and I'm going to paraphrase, like, what Africa can do to help these 2 countries to improve the situation in their relationship and in arms control area. But I would rephrase it to say what non-nuclear weapon states could do to help with the improvement in the US-Russian relationship and in the improvement in arms control and progress in non-proliferation disarmament area. That's my question number 1. But to Sergey and to Adlan, I would like to specifically pose a question is, like, if you had your wish list, what would be assuming that strategic stability is on the list of some of the achievements of the summit tomorrow, what other one or two issues that you would add to your list that is kind of close to your heart, and I think it's very important to get progress between the two countries or internationally. So, question number one about what non-nuclear weapon states could do. I see Vladimir has already unmuted himself and ready to jump for that question. Please.
Thank you, Elena, and thank to our colleague from Senegal for his question and enthusiasm. Actually, Africa suffered from nuclear weapons quite a lot. Directly, not Senegal itself, but not that far. Of course, the French testing in Sahara, but also Africa witnessed the only example when a nation located in Africa, in South Africa, destroyed its own nuclear arsenal, deciding domestically that they don't need it. It would not enhance its security. Quite the opposite, it will damage its security. These lessons are very useful lessons for the whole world. And we in the Russian Federation, I think colleagues in the United States, should not pretend that we have the ultimate truth. In that sense, healthy exchanges between those who are haves with nuclear weapons and those who are strong have-nots, I think are very much needed. And instead of preaching and teaching, we need to exchange experiences here. Listening to each other would be extremely helpful and important, both throughout the NPT review cycle framework, and I think through other frameworks as well, which maybe we should be building together. Thank you.
Thank you, Volodya, very much. And now to our next generation speakers for their wishes for the summit, assuming that strategic stability is tackled by it. Sergey, you go first.
Yes, many thanks for this question. Let alone strategic stability, which should be on the list of the results of this summit. My wish list is quite short, and I don't think this point should be made public, but I wish for unofficial and maybe confidential consultations between Russia and the United States on a broad bilateral agenda to resume, sort of bilateral presidential commission, but unofficial, not very public, because if it is public, Congress, Republican media will make it collapse. But consultations of the restoration of normal work of our diplomatic missions is definitely on my wish list. Just let's make it normal back. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergey. Adlan, to you.
I think my point would continue what Sergey has just mentioned, but specifically applied to the Middle East. Russia and US cannot build a regional security system for the Middle Eastern countries instead of them. But the two are much in power to foster this process and to incentivize their partners, allies in the region. And I think without this coordination, it would be hard to see a sustainable diplomatic process in the region. So I hope that such consultations between our two nations would bring our two nations on the same page in a way, and then we would continue together in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Adlan. Thank you, Sergey. Thank you, Volodya, and thanks to Heather. And to all of you who joined us today. I think it was an excellent discussion. It looks like everybody is energized about the coming summits, and there are hopes, but we were reminded about some of the other developments and impediments and challenges in this process, but still there is a good chance that we'll see some agreements, some move forward. I need to apologize to our speakers and to our participants who sent questions, but they didn't make it to the Q&A session. There were many more questions that we could fit into that short period of time. I once again congratulate our peer colleagues for publishing this book, and I'm looking forward to seeing it in print or online in some other fashion. And thank you, Dr. Orlov and Sergey, Adlan, and Heather for this fascinating discussion today. With that, I wish you and all of our speakers a very good day, and all of you being safe and healthy, and looking for further discussions on that important topic. All the best.
Elena, on behalf of Peer Center, may I thank our host here, the VCDNP, for hosting this meeting, and also thank our authors. We have many of them now in this virtual room. Without our young and experienced authors, there would have been no book, there would be no future for the nuclear non-proliferation. Thank you, and thank them.
Thank you, Volodya, and all the best to all of the authors and other representatives of the next generation.